NFL free agency is hot and heavy, with teams spending a massive $1 billion in one weekend by signing, re-signing, and giving contract extensions to a number of good players. Now, Devontae Adams is set to join the Los Angeles Rams on a 2-year, $46 million deal. Cleveland re-signed defensive end Myles Garrett to a record contract extension that makes him the highest paid non-quarterback in league history. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this the same Myles Garrett who requested a trade from the Browns because he wanted to win? And then the Browns just threw a bunch of money at him. And now with the Browns, he'll average a salary of $40 million per year and $123.5 million in guaranteed money and a no trade clause. And now he's back to being Team Cleveland.
He's rich. He is rich.
What?
He got his own money. And baby, when I tell you he's got his own money, I mean the boy has got his own money.
Also, shout out to Garrett's agent, Nicole Lynn at Clutch Sports. Y'all worked the Browns like it was the third shift at the Waffle House. But no fights, and y'all got all of your teeth. But seeing these players enjoy these multi-million-dollar contracts and having the ability to use their leverage to either stay in place depending on their market value made me think of the person who made a lot of this possible, former Major League Baseball player Curt Flood. It's Flood who changed professional sports forever by creating what we all know as free agency. Now, let me give you the backstory on Curt Flood. He was a center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, one of the best in the game, having won 7 straight Golden Gloves at one point, and he also was a key member of the Cardinals' 1964 and 1967 World Series championship teams. Now, in 1968, the Cardinals again appeared in the World Series, this time against the Detroit Tigers. In the 7th inning of Game 7, Flood made a critical error that many believe clinched the World Series for the Tigers.
And the Tigers now made their first threat with 2 out base hits by Cash and Horton. Brings up the Grand Slam kid, Jim Northrup. He's had 2 homers and 6 runs batted in the series. He had 21 homers and led his team in runs batted in during the season with 90. He's had 1 out of 9 against the pitching of Gibson, and that was a home run. That was the only run that Gibson's permitted in this series. McCarver and Gibson are not discussing the weather, which is beautiful. Northrup hits the ball to all fields. Fly ball, Flood. There, he almost thought he misjudges it over his head. 2 runs are going to score. The same thing that almost happened earlier in the game to Jim Northrup, and now it has happened to one of the greatest defensive center fielders in baseball, Curt Flood.
As he started over, something happened to his underfooting. Watch this now. He catches his spike, see, and he nearly fell down. And that cost him gauging the ball. Flood very rarely has ever misjudged the ball out there, but when he stumbled on his way, it threw him out of his path. He couldn't get back. The ball sailed over his head, and the Tigers now have 2 runs in the 7th, and this all came after 2 out, nobody on.
Now, the Tigers went on to win the World Series, but then things really got interesting. In the spring of the following year, after the World Series loss, Flood and the Cardinals had a bitter contract negotiation. Flood held out during spring training after demanding to receive a $90,000 contract, a pretty healthy sum in those days. Flood got his money, but management remained bitter because in those days, they weren't used to players exercising any leverage. In October of 1969, the Cardinals traded Flood to the Philadelphia Phillies, who were reportedly offering Flood a $10,000 raise that would put his salary at $100,000. Now, Flood wasn't interested and refused to report to Philadelphia. Instead, Flood wrote an 134-word letter to Major League Baseball Commissioner Bowie Kuhn explaining why he wouldn't concede to the trade. Flood wrote, "After 12 years in the major leagues, I do not feel that I am a piece of property to be bought and sold, irrespective of my wishes. I believe that any system which produces that result violates my basic rights as a citizen and is inconsistent with the laws of the United States and of several states. Flood was calling Major League Baseball's reserve clause into question. Under the reserve clause, the only way a player could leave a team is if he was traded or released. Without the ability to make themselves available on the open market, players weren't paid what they truly were worth according to market value because they had no market they could explore. Now, the reason Major League Baseball didn't have to compete for players is because the Supreme Court ruled in 1922 that baseball was exempt from antitrust laws, which are in place to promote competition, prevent monopolies, price fixing, and generally discourage anti-competitive behavior. Baseball is currently the only major sport with an antitrust exemption. Now, Bowie Kuhn refused to grant Flood's request, so Flood filed a lawsuit against the commissioner and Major League Baseball, seeking to overturn Major League Baseball's antitrust status. Now, the Major League Baseball Players Association also voted to back Flood and help pay his legal fees. But as you might imagine, Flood's resistance did not go over well with the establishment, the public, and certainly not the media. Here's Flood being interviewed by renowned sportscaster Howard Cosell, who asked Flood to explain how he could be paid so much money, yet still be so unhappy with his situation.
It's been written, Curt, that you're a man who makes $90,000 a year, which isn't exactly slave wages. What's your retort to that?
Well, Howard, a well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave.
Now, even though it was Cosell that mentioned slavery, you probably can imagine how poorly Flood's comments went over with the fans, owners, and the media. Here's author Brad Snyder, who wrote a book about Flood that is aptly titled Well-Paid Slave, and historian Gerald Early on the backlash Flood received.
That slave analogy pissed off a lot of people. Curt was making 7 times what the average American was making. The thought that someone like that could be a victim of injustice didn't resonate with people.
The Civil Rights Act has been passed, the Voting Rights Act has been passed. By 1968, there's an anti-poverty program. So there's a kind of backlash that's coming from whites. Now you got black people coming out there making irrational statements that I'm making $90,000 a year and I'm a slave.
Now, thankfully, this did not discourage Flood. Oh, y'all want to talk about race? Flood said, well, let's talk about it then.
It's been a master and slave relationship. As long as you do what I say do, you're fine.
As his case worked its way through the legal system, his baseball career suffered. He didn't play at all in 1970. A year later, he was traded to the Washington Senators, but he wasn't the same player. He appeared in just 13 games. He left the Senators in April of 1971 and retired from baseball. Finally, in 1972, Flood's case went all the way to the Supreme Court, but the court ruled in favor of Major League Baseball. And while Curt Flood was managing all of this, not a single Major League Baseball player showed up to the trial to support the player who was fighting for their rights. A few years later, the reserve clause finally ended in Major League Baseball. In 1975, pitchers Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally refused to sign their one-year contracts, but they played anyway. When that season ended, an arbitrator ruled they could become free agents, and that was the final straw that finally led to free agency. Now, I think you all know how this story goes. Neither Andy Messersmith or Dave McNally lost their careers or faced the same criticism that Flood did. But imagine if other players had simply stood with Flood when he filed his lawsuit. Either way, Flood gave everybody the blueprint. Here's Oscar Robertson on how Curt Flood inspired him to take up a similar fight for NBA players in the 1970s.
In basketball, we knew what Curt Flood was trying to achieve, and we felt he was right.
3 months after Flood had filed his lawsuit in 1970, Oscar Robertson and 13 other professional basketball players sued to abolish the reserve clause in the NBA, following an earlier failed attempt by star Rick Barry. 6 years later, they reached a settlement to bring free agency to their sport.
It took until 1993 for the NFL to have full free agency, which was spearheaded by the late Reggie White. The Hall of Famer was the lead plaintiff in a class action antitrust lawsuit against the NFL. Before free agency, every NFL team was allowed to protect 37 players on their roster from leaving to another team. When White left the Philadelphia Eagles to sign a 4-year contract with the Green Bay Packers worth $17 million, it wasn't just something he deserved, but something he truly fought for. On this podcast last week, I mentioned how Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred is considering lifting the ban on Pete Rose from baseball, which would make him eligible for the Hall of Fame posthumously. Now, while Pete Rose was a great player, he crossed a sacred line by gambling on the game. Manfred should instead put that energy behind advocating for Curt Flood to be in the Hall of Fame. Even if you don't think Flood was good enough to be elected as a player, there is precedence for electing Flood as a contributor because of how he impacted the growth of the game. The former executive director of the Players Association, Marvin Miller, is in the Hall of Fame because of his contributions. And it was Miller who Flood consulted with before making his decision to sue Major League Baseball. The average salary of today's pro baseball player is $5 million a year, and that would not have happened without Curt Flood. Major League Baseball needs to atone for blackballing a player whose only offense was standing 10 toes down. I'm Jemele Hill, and I approve this message.